So in essence, my father's side comes from Indonesia and Malaysia, from a place called Jakarta, and their sort of tribal ethnicity was Javanese. So that's where my dad came from and his dad. And my mom's side was born from a slave and master coming together.
I think each and every South African, whether they are black, white, Chinese, Indian, we're all connected to the slave, to our slave ancestry, to our slave history in South Africa. So personally, with my roots are linked to the Indonesian archipelago, India, as well as the European connection.
I was told by my mother that one of my enslaved ancestors was Madagascan, and they called it Talizi.
And so my grandmother is a descendant of one of these slaves of Tesla, because the oral history I have from my father's family is that they had lived there forever.
When we're growing up and we are being politicized, we're singing, myself and others, we at some training camp out in somewhere along the coast, and we're singing Ons swart mense, kinders van slawe, wil ons eie land terug hê. Gee dit terug nou, my boeie, in Afrika.
Well, there's no difficulty in talking about it being a site of memory for the city. The population of Cape Town throughout the period of the Dutch East India Company and well into the following period of British rule, the population of Cape Town was a majority were slaves.
And the slaves were the people who maintained the streets, who carried things to and from ships in the harbour, who built buildings. And so it is wonderful that we have this place in which so many thousands of slaves lived over a 150-year period almost.
Those doors, they would enter into the courtyard. The courtyard during that period of time was seen as the communal space for the enslaved. That is the space where they left in the morning, that is the space where they came back at night, and that is the space during which and in which we had the inhumanity and the violence and gender violence that were perpetrated against the slaves on a daily basis.
What we must realize in that array of humanity for sale, that there would have been people that would at one time had shared the same language, the same cosmology, the same sense of who they are, but they were split. Whatever was built up over the journey, trans-Indian Ocean to here, was broken up again.
We walk past all sorts of places in Cape Town every day, and we have no idea of the stories that are lurking beneath the surfaces of trees, of buildings. And I think understanding the role that slavery played in the shaping of Cape Town.
So what is now Church Square was actually an important meeting place in the Cape, because obviously the settlers would go to the church and they would always be accompanied by their slaves on their way there. So because of the closeness to the slave lodge, and also because of the fact that it was kind of a thoroughfare also to Green Market Square, which was the main trading place. So there is this oral history that there was a tree there and that some slaves were likely sold on that spot.
I think it's extremely important that we have a national memorial for enslavement and for slavery in South Africa, and that the slave tree and the slave lodge should form part of that memorial.
We need a monument to slavery because South Africans on the whole need to understand all the history. We need to understand each other. We've been kept, we're a very fragmented society, and yes, apartheid played a big role.
But the nature of slavery was such that it created forms of hierarchies, of social hierarchies, of attitudes amongst the colonists, of coercion, of control, of paternalism. Formal chattel slavery came to an end back in the 1830s. The aftermath of that was a continuation of many of the forms of coercion, unequal opportunities, unequal rights, which have continued in our country up to the present. Slavery became something which was thought to be shameful, something which you should be embarrassed about admitting. That your ancestors have been slaves or had been slave owners indeed.
And I think, especially within South Africa, there is this gap in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding what slavery was and how it relates to you as a South African, because I think most South Africans, they believe that when they look at slavery, it is only in Cape Town and it's only the coloured people. And that needs to be broken.
The ability to tell a story in the case of slavery has never been owned by the slave descendant community, because that which makes for the telling of story was laid over, was airbrushed out of memory. You go to slaveholding estates of our history, and the bell that's there, it's beautifully preserved, and that is not recalled and is not remembered as something that determined the life rhythm.
Slaves came from so many different places and interacted with each other, means that a lot of the kind of language, cuisine, culture, religious beliefs, belief systems is an amalgam of these. It's something new that was created here, something very distinctive.
A lot of our cooking is Creole cooking. You know, I grew up with thinking that all mense onder die kombese is colored food. It's something that came from Europe. It found its way into our kitchen, and we then added a bit more spices. And a lot of what we cooked was determined by the absence of refrigerator, for one.
We wouldn't have had Afrikaans had it not been for the fact that in the Cape you had large numbers, the overwhelming majority of people who spoke second varieties of Dutch, like slaves and the Khoisan.
My whole schooling was in Afrikaans. My grandfather was illiterate, actually developed a language whereby he could write Afrikaans in Arabic. And he showed me how to do this. I was the only one in the family. I was very privileged.
And what I'd love to see is for us all as South Africans to reach out and to see each other and understand each other, understand how we've all been shaped. In the same way that we understand the pain of apartheid, we need to understand the pain of slavery and also of the indigenous people.
To make the 1st of December a public holiday would be a good start, a day when we can all think about what slavery has meant and what slaves have contributed to the world we're in.
So to encourage storytelling, to encourage the culture, and through the lens of culture, revisit the reality of slave identity.
Plays, drama, storytelling, music.
South Africa has a sizable Muslim population, and that is to a large extent due to the fact of slavery.
Because of slavery, they weren't free to move around. But one of the things that they got was to practice their religion. So every Thursday night they would come together and they would sing. And the masters would say, okay, leave them alone, let them just sing. And this is how I got introduced to religious singing or sacred singing. Because my grandfather was, bless his soul, he died at 93, and he retained all those traditions that they brought from Indonesia. And he passed this on to me.
The songs, again, if you take freedom songs, you know, the way we sang freedom songs, there was a bit more syncopation to it. There was a different downbeat. There's a different rhythm. And it speaks again, people would say, to the gait of somebody that's dragging a chain.
And I said, as long as you identify with yourself as something and not as a human being, you will take sorrow at the end of the day, you know. So, and that's the one lesson I got from Sufism that came with slavery.
You must remember the words of Jose Marti, a Cuban patriot, who said that the true motherland is the human race. It's not Asia, it's not Africa, it's our humanity.